Street. Jude's hospital was a labyrinth of concrete and fluorescent flickering lights. Most of the building had been renovated, but the east wing remained a relic of the 1950s, narrow hallways, heavy swinging doors, and a lingering scent of industrial bleach and rot. Thomas Miller strapped on his watch. 11 p.m., the start of the graveyard shift. "Quiet night, Sarah," the evening nurse said as she handed him the clipboard. She looked pale, her eyes darting toward the end of the darkened corridor. "Just watch out for room 412. The call button keeps shorting out." Thomas nodded. He was used to the glitches of an old building. After Sarah left, the silence settled in. The only sound was the rhythmic hiss-click of the ventilators and the distant hum of the industrial generators. Around 1 a.m., the call button for room 412 chimed. Thomas walked down the hall, his rubber-soled shoes squeaking against the linoleum. He opened the door to 412. The room was empty. The bed was stripped to the mattress, the plastic covering crinkling in the air-conditioned draft. He reached for the reset button, but stopped. On the heart rate monitor, which wasn't connected to anyone, a flat green line was suddenly jumping. Beep, beep, beep. A pulse was being recorded. 60 beats per minute. Steady, strong. Technical glitch, Thomas muttered, his heart skipping a beat. He turned to leave, but the door wouldn't budge. It felt as though someone, or something, was holding the handle from the other side. Through the small rectangular window in the door, he saw a shadow pass by. It wasn't a doctor or a nurse. It was tall, impossibly thin, and wearing a vintage patient gown that looked like it was dripping with wet ink. Then, a voice came over the room's intercom, crackling with static. "Nurse, my IV is dry. I can feel the air in my veins." Thomas backed away from the door, hitting the empty bed. He looked at the heart rate monitor again. The pulse was now 150. 180. 200. The machine let out a long, high-pitched scream of a flatline. Suddenly, the temperature in the room plummeted. Thomas could see his own breath. On the dusty window of the room, words began to appear, as if traced by an invisible finger from the outside. "Patient admitted. No exit." The door finally swung open with a violent thud, hitting the wall. The hallway outside was no longer the hospital he knew. The lights were gone, replaced by a flickering, sickly red emergency glow, and the floor was covered in an inch of dark, stagnant water. Thomas stood frozen at the threshold of room 412. The hallway was unrecognizable. The stagnant water on the floor felt ice cold through his socks, and the red emergency lights pulsed like a slow, dying heartbeat. "Sarah, security," he shouted, but his voice didn't echo. It was flat, as if the walls were made of cotton. He knew he couldn't stay in the open. He remembered the old pneumatic tube system and the paper archives in the basement. If the digital systems were failing, the physical records, the ghost charts, might tell him where he was. He waded through the hallway toward the service elevator. As he passed the nursing station, he saw a chart sitting on the desk. It was yellowed and curled. He picked it up. Patient name, Thomas Miller. Admitted, 11 p.m. Condition, critical. Cognitive dissociation. "This is a joke," he whispered, dropping the folder. But the ink was fresh. It was his handwriting. The elevator doors opened with a jagged, grinding sound. Inside, the floor was covered in discarded surgical masks. He pressed B for basement. The elevator didn't go down. It felt like it moved sideways, a long, nauseating slide into the dark. When the doors opened, the smell hit him, formaldehyde and old blood. This was the archive. Rows upon rows of metal filing. Cabinets stretched into the darkness. Thomas found the 1950s deceased section. He pulled out a drawer. Inside were files of patients who had died during a forgotten staff outbreak in the East Wing. He began flipping through them frantically until he found a photo clipped to a file. It was the tall, thin man he had seen through the window of room 412. Name, Arthur Vance. Note, patient was kept in total isolation. Claimed to hear the hospital breathing. Final words recorded, "It's not a building, it's a stomach." Suddenly, the filing cabinets began to slam shut, one by one, down the row, getting closer to Thomas. Bang, bang, bang. Thomas scrambled back, his flashlight beam swinging wildly. He saw Arthur Vance. The man was standing at the end of the aisle, his skin looking like gray parchment stretched over a bird's skeleton. He wasn't walking, he was twitching, his body flickering in and out of existence like a bad film reel. Arthur raised a hand, pointing toward a heavy steel door labeled Ward 0. "The doctor is ready for your surgery, Thomas," Arthur's voice rasped, coming from the ventilation ducts above. Thomas turned to run back to the elevator, but the doors were gone. In their place was a solid brick wall that looked a century old. The only way out was through Ward 0. Thomas approached the steel door of Ward 0. The handle was freezing, the metal frosted over despite the humid, rot-heavy air of the basement. As he pushed it open, the screech of the hinges sounded like a human scream. Inside, Ward 0 wasn't a ward at all. It was an auditorium, an old-fashioned surgical theater from the early 20th century. Rows of steep wooden benches looked down onto a central operating circle illuminated by a single, flickering halogen lamp. In the center of the circle stood an operating table. On it lay a figure draped in a stained white sheet. The sheet was moving, small, frantic undulations from underneath, as if hundreds of insects were trapped beneath the fabric. "Who's there?" Thomas called out, his voice trembling. A figure stepped out from the shadows behind the table. He wore a heavy, rubberized apron over a tattered tuxedo. His face was covered by a vintage porcelain gas mask, the glass eyes reflecting the flickering light. This was the night surgeon. "Vital signs are dropping, Nurse Miller," the surgeon said. The voice was distorted, sounding like two stones grinding together. "You're late for the harvest." The surgeon picked up a scalpel. It wasn't made of steel, it looked like a shard of black glass that swallowed the light around it. Thomas tried to back away, but his feet felt heavy. He looked down and saw that the dark water on the floor had turned into a thick, black sludge that was slowly climbing up his legs, anchoring him to the spot. "I don't belong here," Thomas shouted. "I'm the staff. I'm not a patient." "In St. Jude's," the surgeon replied, stepping closer, "everyone is eventually processed. The building needs the electricity of your nerves. It needs the marrow of your fear." The figure on the table suddenly sat up. The sheet fell away, revealing Sarah, the nurse who had handed him the shift. But her eyes were gone, replaced by the same flickering red emergency lights that filled the hallways. Her mouth opened, but only the sound of a heart rate monitor's flatline came out. The surgeon raised the black scalpel. "The first incision is always the hardest. It's where we separate the memory from the meat." Thomas realized he couldn't run. He reached into his medical kit on his belt and pulled out a bottle of high-grade surgical spirits and a lighter. "Stay back," Thomas yelled. The surgeon laughed, a hollow, metallic sound. "Fire cannot burn what is already dead, Thomas. But it can make the shadows dance." As the surgeon lunged, Thomas dropped the bottle and flicked the lighter. A wall of blue flame erupted between them. For a split second, the reality of the room shifted. He saw the theater for what it really was. A collapsed, mold-ridden basement filled with rusted pipes and the skeletal remains of long-forgotten patients. But the surgeon didn't disappear. He walked right through the blue flames, the rubber apron melting onto his skin like black tar. The blue flames licked the night surgeon's rubberized apron, but he didn't slow down. He stepped through the fire, the smell of burning chemical and ancient rot filling the room. Thomas scrambled backward, his hands searching the damp, crumbling walls behind him. His fingers caught on a rusted metal grate. The oxygen tunnels. In the original blueprints of the East Wing, these were narrow maintenance shafts designed for the complex piping of the 1950s. If he could get inside, the surgeon's hulking frame wouldn't be able to follow. With a desperate grunt, Thomas kicked the grate. It resisted. He kicked again, the metal groaning until the bolt snapped. He dove headfirst into the dark, narrow hole just as the surgeon's black glass scalpel sliced through the air where his neck had been a second before. Thomas crawled frantically. The tunnel was barely 2 feet wide, filled with sharp copper pipes and the thick, suffocating smell of stale oxygen and grease. Above him, he could hear the surgeon's heavy footsteps pacing the floor of the ward. Clang, clang, clang. The surgeon was striking the pipes. The sound echoed through the tunnel, vibrating in Thomas's teeth. "You're just a parasite in the veins now, Thomas," the surgeon's voice echoed through the ventilation. "But every vein leads back to the heart." As Thomas crawled deeper, the pipes began to change. They were no longer cold metal. They felt warm. They felt soft. He shone his flashlight ahead and gasped. The copper pipes were merging with what looked like human arteries. Giant, pulsating vessels were woven into the infrastructure, pumping a thick, glowing green fluid. The hospital wasn't just a building, it was an organism. He reached a junction where a large fan was spinning slowly. Beyond it, he saw a small, glass-walled observation room. Inside, a little girl in a white dress was sitting on the floor, drawing on the tiles with a piece of charcoal. Thomas pushed through the fan, the blades narrowly missing his shoulders. He tumbled into the room. The girl didn't look up. She was drawing a map of the hospital. But the map was shaped like a human body. "Who are you?" Thomas wheezed, his scrubs torn and bloody. "I'm the chart keeper," she whispered. She pointed to a spot on her drawing that looked like the stomach of the building. "This is where the unlisted go. The ones the doctors forget. The ones the night shift leaves behind." She looked up at him. Her face was perfectly normal, but when she blinked, her eyelids closed vertically, like a reptile's. "The surgeon isn't the one in charge, Thomas. He's just the butcher. You need to find the administrator. He's in the penthouse, but he hasn't breathed air in 70 years. Suddenly, the glass walls of the observation room began to crack. The surgeon was on the other side, slamming his charred, melted fists against the reinforced pane. "He found me," Thomas panicked. "He didn't find you," the girl said, returning to her drawing. "The building told him where you were. The walls have ears, Thomas. And the floors have tongues." The glass shattered inward with a sound like 1,000 falling diamonds. Thomas didn't wait to see the night surgeon's hand reach through the jagged hole. He scrambled toward a service hatch the girl had pointed to, a vertical shaft that led upward, away from the basement's rock. As he climbed the rusted iron rungs, the temperature began to change. It wasn't the freezing cold of the morgue anymore, it was a sweltering, humid heat. The air felt heavy, saturated with moisture and the rhythmic, booming sound of a massive bellows. Whoosh! Ha! He emerged into a space the size of a cathedral. This was the boiler room, but the industrial furnaces had been replaced by something biological. Huge, translucent sacs hung from the ceiling, expanding and contracting with a wet, slapping sound. These were the lungs of St. Jude's. Massive fans, 30 feet wide, spun slowly behind the sacs, pushing the recycled, sickly air through the vents Thomas had just crawled through. "It's breathing," Thomas whispered, wiping the sweat and grease from his forehead. He looked down from the narrow catwalk. Below him, in the pits where coal should have been, were thousands of discarded medical files, swirling in the heat like dead leaves. Among them were piles of clothes, patient gowns, nurses' caps, and doctors' coats, all empty, as if the people inside them had simply evaporated. A shadow moved on the catwalk above him. "Thomas, help me." He looked up. It was Sarah again. But she was different now. She was fused into the wall, her skin stretching and merging with the gray concrete. Her eyes were wide, and thin plastic tubes were stitched into her tear ducts, draining fluid into the hospital's arteries. "Sarah, I'll get you out," Thomas shouted, running toward her. "No," she shrieked, her voice echoing off the metallic lungs. "Don't touch the walls. They're hungry. The administrator, he's watching through the monitors." Suddenly, the massive fans began to speed up. The wind became a gale, pulling Thomas toward the spinning blades. The lungs began to pulse faster, a panicked, hyperventilating rhythm. From the shadows of the machinery, a new figure emerged. It wasn't the surgeon. It was a security guard, but his uniform was fused to his flesh, and his flashlight was embedded in his chest, shining a beam of light through his own ribs. "Trespasser," the guard croaked, raising a heavy iron baton. "In scheduled visit to the respiration chamber." Thomas backed away, but his hand brushed the wall. The concrete felt soft, like a tongue. He felt a sharp sting as small, needle-like cilia began to poke through his scrubs, trying to anchor him to the surface. He pulled away with a scream, leaving a patch of his shirt behind. He realized Sarah was right, the building wasn't just a stomach, it was a trap that integrated its victims into its own structure. He looked at the security guard. "Where is the elevator to the penthouse?" The guard pointed his baton toward the center of the lungs. A high-speed pneumatic lift, used for sending blood samples, had been enlarged into a terrifying glass tube that ran straight up through the heart of the building. "You want to see the boss?" The guard laughed, a sound like dry bones rattling. "He's been waiting for a new pair of eyes." Thomas lunged for the pneumatic lift just as the security guard's iron baton smashed into the catwalk where his head had been. The glass doors of the lift hissed shut, sealing him inside a transparent tube that smelled of ozone and scorched copper. As the lift began its ascent, it didn't move smoothly. It jerked and spasmed, as if the building were having a seizure. Thomas looked through the glass and realized he wasn't passing through floors of concrete and steel anymore. He was passing through the nervous system of St. Jude's. The walls of the shaft were lined with millions of miles of silver, glowing fibers that pulsed with blue electricity. They looked like oversized human nerves, twitching and firing signals. Attached to these nerves were human brains, hundreds of them, suspended in glass jars, their gray matter wired directly into the hospital's grid. The processing power, Thomas whispered, his face reflected in the glass. They aren't just patients, they're the hard drive. Suddenly, the lift stopped between floors. The blue light in the nerves turned a violent, angry red. The intercom inside the lift crackled. Error 404, consciousness not integrated. Commencing reboot. The floor of the lift began to heat up. Thomas looked down and saw that the electricity was leaking into the car. He had to get out. He used his medical shears to pry open the emergency hatch in the ceiling of the lift. He climbed out onto the top of the car, standing in the middle of the shaft. Above him, the silver nerves were beginning to weave together, forming a web that blocked his path. From the darkness of the shaft, voices began to whisper. They weren't coming from speakers, they were the collective thoughts of the brains in the jars. Join the network, Thomas. It's so quiet in the code. Forget your name. Become a signal. A shape detached itself from the wall of the shaft. It looked like a man made entirely of copper wire and glowing fiber optics. Every time it moved, it sounded like a short circuit, bzzzt snap. This was the system architect. You are an unhandled exception, Nurse Miller, the architect said, its face a shifting screen of static. I built this network to be perfect. No pain, just data. But you bring the noise of life into my silence. The architect reached out, and a bolt of blue electricity arched from its fingers, hitting the lift car. The metal beneath Thomas's feet groaned. Thomas looked at the wires. He remembered his training, how to handle a defibrillator. Electricity needs a ground. He saw a heavy copper grounding cable running down the side of the shaft. He grabbed a pair of rubber gloves from his pocket, standard issue for the night shift, and lunged. He didn't attack the architect, he grabbed a handful of the glowing nerves and shoved them against the grounding cable. A massive explosion of white light and sparks blinded him. The entire shaft let out a digital scream. The blue nerves turned black and brittle as the surge backfired through the system. The architect shattered into 1,000 harmless sparks. The lift car shuddered and began to fall, but Thomas managed to grab the edge of a floor opening labeled Floor 13, Neurology. He pulled himself up, gasping for air. But as he looked down the hallway of Floor 13, he saw that the floor wasn't made of tile. It was made of soft, gray brain matter that squelched under his boots. The floor of neurology didn't just feel like brain matter, it felt like a living archive. As Thomas stepped forward, the surface beneath his boots pulsed. With every step, a flash of light erupted from the floor, projecting a hologram into the air. The first flash showed Thomas as a child, sitting in a hospital waiting room. The second showed him receiving his nursing degree. But, as he walked further, the memories began to distort. In the holograms, his mother's face was replaced by the porcelain gas mask of the night surgeon. His graduation certificate was written in the same ink black blood he'd seen in the basement. The hospital was rewriting his history, trying to prove he had never lived a life outside its walls. You're not real, Thomas shouted at the walls. I have a home. I have a life. Do you, Thomas? A voice boomed, echoing through the corridor. It wasn't the architect or the surgeon. It was a voice of absolute authority, the administrator. Look at your hands. Truly look at them. Thomas looked down. His skin was pale, nearly translucent. Beneath the surface, instead of blue veins, he saw thin, silver wires pulsing with digital light. His blood was becoming data. The hallway opened into a circular room filled with glass cubicles. Inside each cubicle was a person, but they weren't sleeping. They were staring at screens that replayed their happiest memories on a loop, while thick, organic needles in the back of their necks drained the emotional energy into the building. Thomas saw a cubicle labeled Miller, T. Inside sat a version of himself, looking peaceful, watching a memory of a summer day at the beach. That version of him was healthy, while the real him was covered in grime, blood, and cooling copper wire. That's the trap, Thomas realized. It gives you a perfect past so you'll give up your future. Suddenly, the glass of his cubicle shattered. The memory Thomas stepped out. He didn't look scared, he looked angry. His eyes were perfectly white, glowing with the sterile light of an operating room. "Why are you fighting?" the memory Thomas asked. "Out there, you are a tired nurse with debt and a lonely apartment. In here, you are eternal. You are part of the great system." The memory Thomas lunged at him. He was faster and stronger because he was made of the hospital's pure energy. They crashed into a wall of filing cabinets, and for a moment, their minds merged. Thomas felt the crushing weight of the administrator's will, a desire to turn the entire world into a giant, sterile ward where no one ever dies because no one is truly alive. Thomas reached for a heavy medical monitor on a nearby cart. He didn't hit his double, he smashed the screen showing the Happy Beach memory. As the screen shattered, the memory Thomas let out a cry of agony. The illusion broke. The double began to dissolve into a pile of gray silt and discarded surgical tape. "I'd rather be a tired man than a perfect ghost," Thomas hissed. The floor beneath him began to liquefy. The administrator was done playing games. The brain matter was turning into a digestive acid. Thomas grabbed a heavy curtain cord and swung himself toward the service stairs. Above him, a massive red eye opened in the ceiling. It wasn't a biological eye, it was a giant camera lens, cold and mechanical. "The administrator will see you now," the lens whispered. The service stairs didn't lead to a floor, they led to a bridge. Thomas emerged onto a narrow catwalk of rusted iron, suspended over a gargantuan, hollow shaft that ran through the very center of St. Jude's. This was the heart. In the center of the void hung a massive, metallic cylinder, the size of a skyscraper's core. It was wrapped in thousands of miles of transparent tubing, through which the glowing green, blood, and red, emotional energy, flowed in a frantic, bubbling whirlpool. The sound was deafening, a mixture of a jet engine's roar and a human heart's wet, heavy thumping. Thump whir, so much life, a voice resonated, shaking the very air in Thomas's lungs. "And yet, you want to waste yours on the outside." Thomas looked up. At the top of the cylinder, seated in a throne of surgical steel and fiber optic cables, was the administrator. He was not a man anymore. His lower body had been replaced by a massive data processing engine. His torso was pale and shriveled, and his head was encased in a helmet of monitors that displayed 1,000 different camera angles of the hospital simultaneously. He was the building's consciousness, literally wired into every brick and beam. "You've seen the lungs, the stomach, and the nerves," the administrator said, his voice coming from the monitors. "You have walked through the history of St. Jude's. Do you still think you are an individual? You are just a white blood cell, Thomas. A small, confused part of a much larger body." Thomas gripped the railing, his knuckles white. "A body doesn't torture its own cells. You're a parasite, not a hospital." The administrator laughed, and on his helmet, a dozen screens showed the night surgeon and the system architect standing on the catwalks below Thomas. He was surrounded. "A parasite provides nothing," the administrator countered. "I provide order. I provide a place where the dead don't have to leave, and the living don't have to fear. I am the cure for the ultimate disease, mortality." The administrator raised a skeletal hand. The transparent tubes around the heart began to disconnect, whipping through the air like venomous snakes. They sprayed the glowing green fluid everywhere, and where it touched the catwalk, the metal began to hiss and dissolve. Thomas saw his objective. At the base of the administrator's throne was the main cooling intake. If he could contaminate the blood of the building at its source, the whole organism would overheat. He reached into his pocket. He still had a small vial of highly concentrated insulin he'd grabbed from a crash cart in the memory ward. In a human, it would regulate sugar. In a biological machine built on high energy consumption, a massive dose of insulin would cause a systemic shock, a metabolic crash. "I'm not a cell," Thomas yelled, leaping over a gap in the catwalk as a tube lashed out at him. "I'm the virus." The night surgeon lunged from the shadows, his black glass scalpel gleaming. Thomas didn't fight back. He threw his heavy flashlight at the surgeon's porcelain mask, shattering it. Behind the mask was nothing but a void of black smoke. Thomas rolled under the surgeon's grasp and sprinted toward the intake. He was inches away when the administrator's monitors all turned bright red. "You think you can kill a god?" the administrator screamed. Suddenly, the floor beneath Thomas turned into a conveyor belt, pulling him backward, away from the heart, toward a massive, whirring meat grinder designed for waste processing. The roar of the waste processor was a mechanical growl, the smell of ozone and industrial grinders filling the air. Thomas clawed at the conveyor belt, his fingernails snapping as they caught on the cold, moving metal. He was sliding backward toward the spinning blades that awaited medical waste. Rejected material, the administrator's voice boomed. If you will not be a part, you will be ash. Just as his boots touched the edge of the grinder, Thomas jammed his heavy iron medical shears into the belt's mechanism. The metal shrieked. The belt jerked, the motor smoking as it fought against the obstruction. Thomas used the moment of friction to propel himself forward, leaping toward the central cooling intake. The administrator's immune response began. The walls of the central shaft began to weep a thick, white fluid, leukocytes of the building. These weren't cells, they were small, pale, humanoid shapes with no faces, emerging from the concrete like maggots. They moved with a hive mind, crawling over each other to form a living wall between Thomas and the heart. Don't let him touch the intake. The administrator shrieked through 100 monitors. Thomas was covered in the white fluid. It burned like acid, melting his scrubs. He pulled out the vial of concentrated insulin. He knew he only had one shot. He didn't try to fight through the wall of faceless creatures. He looked up at the massive, pulsing artery that fed directly into the administrator's throne. He climbed the side of the cooling tank, the faceless things grabbing at his ankles, pulling him down with a weight like wet cement. Their touch felt like a numbing anesthetic, trying to put his senses to sleep. Sleep, Thomas, they whispered in unison. No more shifts. No more pain. I'm not finished yet. Thomas roared. He smashed the vial against the glass of the main artery. The glass was reinforced, but it was under immense pressure. The crack spread like a spiderweb. Thomas took the jagged edge of his broken shears and hammered it into the fracture. Crack. The green fluid sprayed out with the force of a fire hose, drenching Thomas. He shoved the remaining insulin and a bottle of caustic cleaning bleach he'd snatched earlier into the breach. The effect was instantaneous. The green blood in the tubes turned a sickly, muddy brown. The heart's rhythm faltered. Thump, whir, thump, cough. The administrator let out a sound that wasn't human. It was the sound of 1,000 computer servers crashing at once. The monitors on his head began to display system failure. The silver nerves in the walls began to turn black and shrivel, sparking violently. What have you done? The administrator wailed, his shriveled torso shaking. The order. The perfection. It's all rotting. The faceless creatures began to dissolve into puddles of white goo. The building began to groan, a deep, structural sound of a giant dying. The temperature in the shaft began to skyrocket as the cooling system failed. You're having a seizure, Thomas gasped, wiping the green sludge from his eyes. And I'm the one signing the death certificate. But the hospital had one final reflex. The ceiling of the shaft began to collapse, heavy concrete slabs falling like guillotines. The administrator, in his final moments of consciousness, turned the entire power of the building into a single, localized blast of electricity aimed directly at the catwalk where Thomas stood. The world turned into a blinding white screen. The administrator's final surge of electricity hit the catwalk, melting the iron into glowing slag. Thomas felt himself weightless for a second before he slammed into a pile of discarded files at the very bottom of the shaft. The building was dying. Above him, the heart began to glow with a violet, unstable orange light. The biological sacs, the lungs, were bursting, releasing decades of trapped, stale air in a series of concussive pops. System. Critical, the intercom sputtered, the voice now sounding like a dying old man. Thomas dragged his broken body through the debris. His legs felt like they belonged to someone else, but the adrenaline kept his heart pounding against his ribs. He looked up and saw the administrator. The boss was no longer a god. His monitors were shattered, and his shriveled body was being consumed by the very wires that had once fed him. The building was reclaiming its master as it collapsed. Thomas found the emergency exit at the base of the shaft, a heavy lead-lined door meant for radiation shielding. He threw his weight against it. It didn't move. Thump thump. The heart was about to explode. He looked around and saw the night surgeon's black glass scalpel lying in the dust. He grabbed it, the blade felt like cold vacuum, and jammed it into the electronic lock of the door. The black glass. acted as a perfect conductor, short-circuiting the lock. The door hissed open. Thomas stumbled out into the cool night air of the parking lot. He didn't stop. He ran until his lungs burned, collapsing behind a line of ambulances just as St. Jude's East Wing breathed its last. There was no fire, no orange explosion. Instead, the building simply imploded. The reality that had been stretched to hold the hospital snapped back. The concrete turned to dust, the glass turned to sand, and the screams of the integrated patients faded into a low, mournful whistle of wind. When the dust settled, the East Wing was gone. In its place was a flat, empty lot of cracked asphalt, as if nothing had ever been built there. 1 week later, Thomas sat in a small diner miles away, his hands still trembling as he held a cup of coffee. The official report said there had been a massive gas leak and structural failure. The missing staff were listed as victims of a tragic accident. He looked at his reflection in the diner window. He looked older. His eyes were bloodshot. "More coffee, honey?" the waitress asked. Thomas nodded, but as she poured the coffee, he froze. He looked at the waitress's wrist. There, etched into her skin in faint, silver lines, was a patient ID number, STJ001. He looked around the diner. The man at the counter had a flickering red light in his eyes. The clock on the wall wasn't ticking, it was making a rhythmic hiss-click sound, like a ventilator. Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out his own hand. He peeled back a small bandage on his palm. There were no stitches, no blood. Instead, he saw a small, glowing green fiber optic wire pulsing beneath his skin. He hadn't escaped. The administrator had been right. You don't leave St. Jude's. You just get transferred to a different ward. The world around him flickered for a split second, revealing the gray, sterile walls of a hospital room before snapping back to the diner. Thomas took a slow sip of his coffee. It tasted like industrial bleach and copper. Quiet night, he whispered to himself. Somewhere in the distance, a call button chimed.